Russia has been drawn into the US presidential race numerous times with allegations of email hacking and leaks about the campaigns. Whether Americans select Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the November general election, the next US president and Russian President Vladimir Putin will face numerous issues and conflicts, including Ukraine, Syria and ISIL. We begin our coverage with this report from CCTV's Julia Lyubova from Moscow.
Moscow brushes aside any accusations of meddling in the US election campaign. In fact, Moscow calls these accusations a string of pseudo-sensations. Russian intelligence services were alleged to have hacked into and leaked emails from the Democratic National Committee, with the Kremlin accused US politicians of using what it calls an illusory Russian threat as a trump card. But in fact, Moscow has made it quite clear who it would like to see as the new president of the United States. Vladimir Putin has already called Donald Trump a very talented person, and Russian state media has been showing a string of Trump-friendly reports, while it portrays Hillary Clinton as somebody who cannot be trusted. As a result, this is reflected in the mood of the public, and the researcher company YouGov carried out a poll in Russia in May, and that showed that more than 30% of Russians would like to see Donald Trump as the new president of the United States, while Hillary Clinton got just about 10% of support. And while Vladimir Putin would prefer to see a Moscow-friendly US president, Moscow and Washington continue to cooperate in many areas. Moscow and Washington are closely negotiating on Syria, and the two countries have helped to reach an agreement with Iran on its nuclear program. It's a tricky relationship between the two countries. There are many common grounds. However, there are many disagreements at the same time as well, for example, on the future of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and also on Ukraine. But when Hillary Clinton was the US Secretary of State, she famously pressed the reset button with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And now Sergei Lavrov says Moscow is ready to work with any new US president. And it remains to be seen if that reset button can be pressed once again between Moscow and Washington. Julia Lyubova, CCTV, Moscow.
Joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio is Ray McGovern. He served as an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency for 27 years. From Providence, Rhode Island, we're joined by Vladimir Golstein. He's an associate professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Also with us here in Washington is Jim Jatras. He's a former U.S. diplomat and served as a policy advisor and analyst for the Republican leadership in the U.S. Senate. Welcome to all of you. Ray McGovern, Russia, willingly or unwillingly, has been drawn into this election campaign. As we just heard, the Russians have been accused of hacking the computers of the Democratic National Committee. Trump has been accused of being disloyal. In fact, he's also been accused of acting in the interests of Russia. What do you make of this? Is it just a distraction, or can it do some damage here?
Well, it's hard to suppress a laugh here for several reasons. You mentioned distraction. Well, this is a magnificent obsession distraction. What happened was someone leaked, not hacked, leaked to WikiLeaks, incriminating information indicating that Hillary Clinton and her pals on the Democratic National Committee stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. It's right there in the emails, clear as day. 4 of the top officials from the DNC were immediately canned. And how are they going to explain this right before the convention? And so, oh, Russia did it. Russia did it. And so I said, well, what do you mean Russia did it? Well, and then they construct this whole thing where the media just falls right into line. Said the Russians did it. The Russians. Why did the Russians do it? Because they want to get Hillary Clinton, because they prefer Donald Trump. Now, yeah, I know something about Russian leaders, okay? Someone who advertises themselves as totally unpredictable and proud of it, that's the last person that Vladimir Putin or anyone else would want to have as the president of the United States. I don't know how bad, I don't care how bad Hillary Clinton is, and she's pretty bad, but the notion that the Russians would prefer to have Trump, you know, the Russians, I mean, the Russians at the top, not the men in the street. Right. That's ridiculous on its face. So the whole premise is wrong, and the whole argument, they want to hurt Hillary to help Trump, and therefore they leaked it to WikiLeaks. Of course, WikiLeaks is quite capable of receiving leaks all by itself, as we have known from the past.
Vladimir, Russia has denied these accusations, and it may or may not be election rhetoric, but in reality, will it hurt relations between the United States and Russia?
Well, I don't think it will hurt a relationship because I suspect players on both sides know what's going on. Russians know that this is some kind of an election gimmick, election trick, that obviously Democratic campaign is not doing very well, primarily because their record is weak. Their message is weak. So they are blaming Messenger now. They are trying to say something bad about Russia, something bad about Trump. But the fact is that it's very difficult for them to connect with American people. American people see economy floundering. American people see that foreign policy, endless amount of mistakes. So this rhetoric of trying to avoid these issues and blaming Russia is just a ploy. And media magnifies it, creates echo chambers. So I suspect that some of the American public fall for that. But I don't think Russian leadership falls for that, and I don't think even people in the know in Democratic Party fall for that. So it's just a gimmick, I suspect.
Jim, what is your view on this? Especially, what is behind Donald Trump's apparent admiration for Vladimir Putin?
I think I'm going to disagree with my colleagues here a little bit because I think it is quite damaging. If you look at the essence of this, it is a smokescreen. It is something that's thrown out by Hillary and her people to hide the corruption, frankly, that Ray refers to. But I do think it is damaging to have this kind of neo-McCarthyite atmosphere of hatred, not only toward Donald Trump, but toward Russia and obviously toward Vladimir Putin. Because you think of what Trump has actually said. What is his big offense? Why did Michael Morell, former acting director of the CIA, accuse him of being an unwitting agent of influence for the Kremlin? Because he wants to get along with the Russians rather than call them names like thug and Hitler and things like this, the language that somebody like Hillary Clinton has used, and frankly a lot of Republican politicians as well, that if we get away from this neoconservative maniacal hatred of Russia and see where our interests coincide in places like Syria, where we do have interests in common, backing off from confrontation in Ukraine, how is this any different from what Trump is proposing from the way Reagan talked to Gorbachev, or the way Brezhnev and Nixon talked, or Eisenhower talked to Khrushchev? I mean, this is a very serious relationship with the only other country on the planet that's capable of destroying us, and we have this mindless hatred being whipped up here. Red's under the bed, even though Moscow's not red anymore.
Right.
It's really something we haven't seen in decades, and I think it's very, very damaging and rather scary, both internationally and in a domestic political context.
Ray, we have seen some commentary that fits into what you've been telling us just a moment ago, and that is, when we look at whom the Russians might want to be president, there was something published by Nina Khrushcheva, who is the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier. And she wrote in this commentary piece, she said Putin might prefer Clinton. And the reason, she said, is because Clinton is measured, pragmatic, and more accustomed to Russian-style diplomacy.
Well, that may be. It's always a question of compared to what. Okay. Now
compared to Donald Trump,
you have Mr. Unpredictable on the one hand, and then you have Mrs. Very Predictable, who never saw a war that she didn't fall in love with, who has stoked up all kinds of havoc in the Middle East, not only Iraq, Syria, but Libya, where she was pretty much the godmother of that chaos.
Right.
And so it's really hard for me to think that Putin would have any preference here, It's hard for me to think that he would want somebody totally unpredictable, but by the same token, he knows Hillary Clinton and what she stands for. He knows that Victoria Nuland, who orchestrated the coup d'etat in Kiev on the 22nd.
Victoria Nuland was at the State Department.
Yeah, she was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs.
Still is, isn't she?
And she still is, yeah. But she's a protege of Hillary Clinton. She was her public affairs person. So Hillary is very much a piece of what we call the neocons in Washington. And that means someone who thinks, or at least pretends to think, that the United States is the sole indispensable country of the world. Okay, now what does that make, by definition, all the other countries, whether it's Russia, China, or whatever? Well, by definition, that makes them indispensable. Well, people don't get it. Putin himself warned about that in an op-ed in the New York Times, just a couple of weeks after he pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire on Syria, okay? So we could get those things destroyed, and he did, okay? And he said, you know, I really treasure our new working relationship. This was September 11th, 2013, okay? Right. He said, I treasure our working relationship, but I have to disagree with the president on one thing, and that is that you really shouldn't give any people the notion that they are indispensable or so exceptional that they're apart from the rest of the world. The rest of the world is also worthy of respect. And when God looks down at everyone, says Mr. Putin, and I know that he wrote this paragraph himself, I know from a good source, he says, you know, he sees different kinds of people, but they're all equal under God's care. Well, yeah, I happen to believe that's to be true. But by definition, that's not U.S. policy. We are more equal than all other people.
Vladimir, in terms of whatever preference Russia would want, would President Putin prefer a President Clinton or President Trump? President Clinton, of course, as we've been discussing, would be someone who is a known quantity. President Trump is seen as erratic, unpredictable.
I would say that Russia, first of all, judges situation by the actions rather than the words. And I would say that in the recent years, the behavior of Democratic Party and Democratic leadership was rather unpredictable and rather dangerous. It's actually can very easily lead to further escalation, which will bring the whole world down. You know, there was a very strong kind of interaction which project Russian anger in Georgia in 2008. There's definitely very unhealthy escalation of situation in Ukraine. So Russia knows that this democratic leadership is unbelievably dangerous and can lead to the whole explosion. So I would say I wouldn't reduce it to the question of personalities, Putin, Clinton, or Trump. I think the whole world should be concerned with the fact that current democratic leadership do not read signs, do not understand frustration of other countries. They push Russia and Ukraine. They push China and South Sea. And I think it's both dangerous and unpredictable. I think the person who says that he wants to make deals and negotiate sounds for me much more plausible. So I think it's a very serious situation. And I think Russia is definitely correctly concerned and correctly is interested in this, as the whole world should be interested. United States make it clear that they interfere in every part of the world, so it's not surprising that the whole world is interested in elections.
Jim, you want to say something?
Yeah. Ray earlier said that maybe the Russians wouldn't prefer Trump because he's unpredictable, whereas Hillary is predictable. But I guess I would disagree with that as well. I think she's so predictably bad, so predictably dangerous, that the Russians would look at Trump, I can't read their minds, but if I were in their shoes and say, look, here's somebody who's essentially a nationalist. He is not an ideologue of any sort that anybody can tell. He is not needlessly or gratuitously provocative in foreign policy terms. His attitude would be that of a businessman. Let's make a deal. Where do our interests coincide? Where they not coincide? Let's do some horse trading.
Okay, I want you to take a listen to what he told the American television network ABC a short while ago. Let's have a look at this.
If our country got along with Russia, that would be a great thing. When Putin goes out and tells everybody, and you talk about relationship, but he says Donald Trump is going to win and Donald Trump is a genius, and then I have people saying you should disavow. I said I'm going to disavow that. But when Putin says good things, and when we have a possibility of having a good relationship with Russia, I think that's good.
By bowing to his annexation,
we're not going to be bowing to anybody. Hey, George, you know me pretty well. I don't bow, okay? I don't bow.
Does that translate into good foreign policy, or are we talking about a man who is vain?
I don't. I'm sure, look, there are very few shrinking violets in the presidential field. Of course, there's an element of vanity with him, with Hillary Clinton, with any politician who aspires to be president. I don't think you can attribute it to vanity. Now, again, back to Mr. Morell saying this is how he was suckered in by Putin's nefarious psychological tricks because he played upon his vanity. I think you can't really take that seriously. I think he is saying exactly what I said earlier, that he sees that getting along is more beneficial to the interests of the United States and the American people than this gratuitous attitude of encroaching in other countries' space right up to their borders and even within their borders in terms of our regime change and color revolution and other activities. I think what he's saying is, despite whatever you might think about a personal style and whether he's unpredictable or even erratic in some ways, is what he's saying making sense from a policy point of view compared to somebody who is such an ideologue in the style of, I would say, Clinton, George Bush, Obama, the whole continuum since really the end of the Cold War.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation about the U.S. presidential race and future relations with Russia right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Well, welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the U.S. presidential race and how the outcome could impact Washington's relationship with Moscow and beyond. Let's get back to our panel right now. Ray, we see a lot of negative perceptions being generated here in the United States about Russia, about President Putin, a lot of it by the media. Let's listen to what Stephen Cohen, the professor emeritus at New York University as well as Princeton University, a Russian scholar, he said during an interview on CNN.
We're in a more war with Russia. We're approaching nation with Russia, both along Russia's borders and possibly over Syria. There is absolutely no debate about this in the American media, including, forgive me, on CNN. Then along comes unexpectedly Donald Trump, who says something that suggests he wants to end the new Cold War, cooperate with Russia in various places, what we used to call détente, and only can be called neo-McCarthyite charges that he's a Russian agent, that he's a Manchurian candidate, that he's Putin's client. So the real danger is what's being done to our own political process.
So, Ray, firstly, let me ask you this. Are we heading into a new Cold War here?
Well, we're well into a one-sided Cold War. The problem is that Putin won't cooperate.
He doesn't want to fight the war?
We mounted a coup on his doorstep. And what he did was just to make sure there's only all-weather, all-year naval port was secured by holding the referendum in Crimea. So-called pro-Russian separatists are active in the eastern Ukraine, but that's just because the Minsk Accords, ones that are supposed to give them some regional autonomy, have not been honored by the regime in Kiev. The regime in Kiev is rife with protests. Now, if you look at Putin, and you look at his experience, he was born after the war, but his big brother was killed and died in Leningrad in the siege. When he looks at all this and sees 31,000 NATO troops on the border between Poland and Russia, well, the last time that happened was 75 years ago when they went into Russia, right? Mm-hmm. So I have been impressed by his sang-froid, his unwillingness to be provoked, and I think he has the high cards because this is his neighborhood. Not only that, but I would mention one other thing. I would have expected the Chinese, as sensitive as they are to people who invade or change borders, I would have expected them to criticize what Mr. Putin did in Crimea. No way did they. So there's an alliance, in effect, between China and Russia. And you have players like Iran and India and others, really important countries, that are really prepared to thumb their nose at the United States unless it seems to behave a little better. And it's not behaving any better when the German foreign minister accuses it of what's the word? He's stoking up artificial tension on the border between Poland and Russia. This has got to stop, or else the U.S. will continue to erode what respect it has in the rest of the world.
Vladimir, when we look at these big developments in the region, if we look at what Ray has been talking about, what's happening in Ukraine right now, the fact that the Minsk agreement is not being honored in the eastern part of Ukraine, the fact that NATO has expanded eastwards, the fact that NATO is also talking about anti-missile technology and deployments along Russia's border, what does one make of it?
My feeling is that Ukraine was absolute fiasco. This idea of NATO expansion, idea of, kind of provoking Russia or trying to prove something to Russia by wresting Ukraine from under its influence, totally failed. But this current administration and people who put it in, it works, are not willing to acknowledge it. And they're pushing further and further, and rather than solving it somehow, kind of settling it, they actually escalating it. And this is really ridiculous. So in that sense, for any person with a common sense who is kind of, aware that Cold War can become hot war, we really need to reset a button. So the way to reset a button, I suspect, and that's one of the reasons what I personally would prefer, and I would vote for Donald Trump, because we need some kind of new leadership who won't be afraid to say, let's rethink about it. Because people who put this failed policy, like Victoria Nuland, are scheduled to be in charge, under Hillary Clinton, and I think they're not going to back off. So that's as simple as that.
Jim, as far as pushing a reset button, that was a question that was posed by our correspondent at the end of her report from Moscow. Is that likely to happen? Are we going to see the election rhetoric cool down? We're going to have the election, and then we're going to see, pragmatic policies being adopted?
I think it depends on who wins, frankly.
Right.
What it comes to, I'm actually much more pessimistic than my two colleagues. I think we are in a Cold War. We've been in a Cold War for some time. I agree with Ray that Putin is trying not to respond to provocation, not to get drawn in. You read nationalist voices in Russia. Putin is actually a very moderate personality in a Russian context. There's some people saying he should have sent the tanks into Ukraine. He should have taken them all the way to Kiev, all the way to Lvov. Obviously, he did not want to be drawn in. My fear is that remember, Trump is running against not just Hillary Clinton, not just against the American media, but an entire corrupt oligarchic establishment, which is just as much Republican as it is Democrat. Look at those letters that have been signed by dozens and dozens of national security specialists opposing Trump because he's irresponsible. My fear is if Hillary wins and this crowd stays in and the kind of policy we've seen over the last couple of decades continues and intensifies, we're not just looking at a Cold War situation. We're looking at the prospect of a hot war with a nuclear power. With Russia, I wouldn't rule out, by the way, a war-like confrontation with China either in the South China Sea. These people are terribly irresponsible. As Ray says, they haven't met a war they didn't like. Hillary is certainly of that mind. When you hear, again, not to pick on Mr. Morell again, the idea that we should be assassinating Russian personnel in Syria, doing it covertly, but so they'll get the message. Are these people think this is a game? I'm afraid there are a lot of people in Moscow and maybe some people in Beijing who are beginning to get the cold, queasy feeling that the Americans are set on war, or at least risking war, in order to maintain our dominance over them. And I fear some kind of a stupid miscalculation that results in a hot war, not just a Cold War.
But Ray, is there a recognition in the United States that there's a lot of things that they need to cooperate with Russia on? For instance, Syria, what's the situation going on there right now, as well as counterterrorism? Is that happening right now?
The intelligence services are cooperating on counterterrorism. And it's interesting you mentioned Syria in this connection, because Syria is much closer to Russia than to the United States. This is a problem. Putin has skin in this game. He's got about 3,000 Chechens and other people from Central Asia who are being trained, equipped, and becoming really good terrorists in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, okay? What happens when they come back? He's got to deal with that, and he's told Obama that. When they met at the UN in September, and Putin said, now, I just want to let you know that tomorrow, all those planes that we put into Syria, we're going to use them because we're not really satisfied with the progress that you're making. We hope that you'll cooperate with us. To his credit, Obama said, Kerry, meet with Lavrov, work it out, make sure we don't shoot each other down. So you're right, there are areas of cooperation. But when we're talking about Trump, a broken clock is correct, absolutely correct, twice a day, right? And when you look at him react to imagined or real slights, he says, I'm going to punch him in the mouth. Now, is that the kind of person that you want to have with his finger on the nuclear button? I don't think so. And so I think this is something that that really needs to be addressed when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says Russia is the existential threat with no proof. What's new? You know, why do you say Russia? Last time it was terrorism. Last time it was some drug that's going on, or disease. So there are real problems here in terms of our military and the military-industrial complex. And let's face it, war is really good for business, peace not so good.
And that is an entirely new and different conversation. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.